Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you for coming out in this weather. My name is Gaston Alonso. I am the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities, and I welcome you to our event on union power. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague who will be leading, but I did want to introduce Alan Aja, the chair of the Department of Puerto Rican and Latinx Studies.
Wow.
Alan's going to be leading us in conversation, but I did want to take a moment to acknowledge Alan's support for Hess Week. He and his department have really gone beyond other departments in terms of really creating a home for Paul, but also working with us to make sure that their students are in our events, that our events are part of their curriculum. And so I did want to acknowledge the department for their work with us, making sure that Hess Week is a success. And with that, I turn it over to Alan.
All right. All right. Mi gente, ¿cómo estamos? How we doing? How you doing? Yeah, all right. Good. My name is Alan Aja. I'm honored to be chair of Puerto Rican Latinx Studies Department here at Brooklyn College. I'm also the co-director of the Mellon Transfer Student Research Program, along with Jean Theo Harris and Joseph Enton, right? And I'm also a very at-large member of the PSC-CUNY executive. And I say that because a lot of us wear many hats, and I do my best to be a fellow union activist here. Before anything, I always like to begin everything we do by thanking or acknowledging, honoring the workers. Special thanks to the janitors, the maintenance staff, library staff, the Wolf staff. Thank you, students, right, for your tremendous work this week. I know I also speak on behalf of Pearls in saying it's been an incredible week for us to have Paul here. And before I talk a little bit, I'm actually going to be kind of a co-moderated co-presenter, and I do want to say that when I co-moderate, I do a little side to side. I'm not going to dance for you. Don't worry. But what I mean is, I'll talk about it in a second. Let me explain. First of all, if you're a student and you did not sign on the way in, be sure to sign in on the way out. We need to account for that until the revolution comes, we need to have that kind of accountability one day for education's sake, right? Also, this event is being live streamed. The recording of it will be posted on the Wolf Institute's YouTube channel. Gotta tell you that. And also, at the end of the event, we're going to take Q&A that's related, and I want to remind you, related to the central theme of the event. And we'll ask you to keep your questions and your comments as such. Also, we're student-centered. Students, you will have the right to ask questions and speak first. We're going to make time for that, okay? And then we'll open it up to the larger community. I also want to remind you that Hess Week events tomorrow, in this very room tomorrow, at las 11 a.m., not 8 a.m., my God. It's been a long week. We're not done, actually. The schedule is over here. But there's a blueprint for solidarity, Black, Latinx, and Asian American freedom struggles, and here in this very auditorium. So come on out, mi gente, all right? Before I introduce our esteemed guest speakers, I want to begin with someone you probably never heard of. His name is Jim Branson. Jim Branson is one of those unsung heroes or one of those foot soldiers of the labor movement. And he passed, I believe, about a year ago. I'm mentioning Jim, and I'm starting with a person you probably never heard of, right? Because actually he wanted it that way. He preferred to be in the background. He was one of the union organizers who trained me as a organizer when I went to work in the state of Texas, in Texas. I worked in Austin and El Paso, Texas. And he was one of those people that was committed to anti-racism. He was committed to anti-capitalism, committed to socialism. He was a member of the Georgia Communist League. He worked throughout the part of the South. He's an amazing human being. And he personified what a multiracial union movement should look like. So I want to kind of dedicate a little bit of what I'm saying right now to him. But the reason why I'm bringing him up, the union that I worked for called the Texas State Employees Union, it was actually co-founded by someone, I'm going to bring up Pearls here, co-founded by a person named Eliseo Medina, who used to work or organize with the United Farm Workers. Now, for the Pearl students in the house, if you take our intro course, somewhere around week 6 or 7, we talk about the Dolores Huertas, right, and the Cesar Chavez's. Eliseo is one of those heroes as well. So he goes to Texas in the 70s, helps found this union, and I was honored to work there. Jim was one of the people that helped train me. And in the mornings, this was actually a kind of weirdly academic union in that in the mornings we would organize staff at the University of Texas system in Austin primarily, in El Paso as well, El Paso. And they were mostly staff, professors, and so forth. And in the evening, it'd be janitors and maintenance workers, right? And he really believed in cross-title union solidarity. So presented Jim. And the reason why I bring up Jim is because years later, I had no idea I was actually talking to a quasi-celebrity in the documentary world. Have any of you ever seen the film, maybe, maybe not, called Harlan County, USA?
No, I do not.
All right. Well, you got to see it. It's an award-winning documentary by a person named Barbara Koppel. And it turns out that Jim is one of the, has a small cameo. He's in the film in a union meeting. And I didn't know this about Jim's background. I had no idea I was trained by this incredible human being who was in this amazing film about a strike right in Harlan County in Kentucky, where I spent actually half of my life. Yes, there are Latinx in Kentucky, believe me, right? And turns out his future life partner, Ann Lewis, was also working on the film, right? And I also got to meet her in Texas. But the reason why I want to bring up this film, right, because I first saw it at the University of Kentucky in a rural sociology course. And we were able to talk about the film in the context, and there's also a film that is shown in gender studies courses, right? Because it centers women who were the leaders, basically the leaders of the strike, while their partners and husbands worked in these mines with these horrible companies, right? Without them, no strike, right? And so it's in labor studies courses, right? Sociology courses, sociology of race courses as well, because there's depictions there, or not depictions, like the documentary of multiracial organizing, right? I start off with this film, right? Because I want to thank the professors, right? Who were able to have the academic freedom to show it, because in that state of Kentucky where I actually spent part of my life, they are now engaging or trying to implement laws that disallow the ability to show films like that. Similarly to what's happening in Florida, in Texas, and Arkansas, where the very courses that you're taking right now in Pearls and Africana, right, women gender studies, are under threat, something we're going to be talking about, and talking about how unions are playing a role in defending the academic freedom to do so, right? And I want to take from that, and just the other day my son came home. He's a high school student here in Brooklyn, telecommunications. Anybody in the house? By chance? Okay, all right, cool, that's cool. He came home with the book Mouse, the graphic novel by Art Spiegelman, right? And it's this incredible sort of graphic novel that depicts Nazi persecution of Jews, right? And across his shelf, also, I noticed in my son's room, is Spider-Man Across the Universe, right? And I'm thinking about these books, right? I'm thinking about that because Professor Alonso, what was the number where'd he go? Was it 440? 4,000, I'm sorry. Yes, and I found that some of these books are being targeted for banning, right? And on these so-called lists. And I want to thank those teachers who are teaching my son these books and are able to teach you, right? So I get very excited. It's what we do here, right? And having that freedom to teach, and right. So I want you to do something a little fun. I want you to turn just for a second, right? And I'm going to just throw myself into this. When I was in high school, one of the first things I got to read that really blew my mind was Maya Angelou's "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings," another book called Richard Wright, Black Boy, right? And then I heard for the first time a group called Public Enemy. Right? And then I also, later on in life, I have many examples I could give you, but do you mind turning to the person next to you and think about a film, a song, a book, a music that you either first saw yourself, that blew your mind, or that transformed, or actually for you broke down barriers? Take a minute to do that. What was that? Well, to yourselves. Okay, all right, for the sake of time, all right, thank you for Thank you for doing that. Real quick, by your emotions, you can say it loud. How do you feel doing that, talking about that?
It was hard.
That was hard, right? Yeah?
It was refreshing.
Refreshing. Okay, good. Another word, another term to describe it. How was it? It can also be frustrating, right? Yeah, exactly. All right. So let's transition here to set the larger context of what we're going to do today. According to the American Association of University Professors, and according to a recent document that came out in January, there's been political interference in U.S. higher education, and it's reached an alarming rate, according to a recent report. Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, it goes on, Texas, where I worked. They passed bills seeking to marginalize and even criminalize teaching and research on issues of race and gender. In doing so, this report says they subvert the possibility that as a site of free inquiry, right, the university can serve the common good, right? Another joint report with the American Federation of Teachers actually identifies 4 trends. 1, restricting academic freedom by limiting teaching about race, gender, and sexuality. 2, requiring intellectual and viewpoint diversity statements and surveys. 3, cutting funding for diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And 4, weakening faculty rights by eliminating tenure and placing restrictions on collective bargaining, unionization, right? Real quick, I'll wrap this up, right? Just before the pandemic struck, I was actually at the New College of Florida giving a talk on my first book on the ways in which Cubans, I grew up actually in Miami, Florida, and I wrote a book using census data and also ethnographies about the ways that white Cubans that look like me, these right, were used the state in ways to allow our economic ascension at the cost of black Cubans and black Latinos in South Florida. I went and gave that talk. That talk was based on fact, in lived experience, and so forth. It turns out that now the talk I gave them would not be allowed, right? Recently, the board has actually banned the gender studies program there. They threw out the board. New College of Florida is like an honors college, kind of, right? It's been a haven of liberal arts for many years in Florida. And I turned to a colleague who invited me. I said, yo, would I be invited back now? He's like, absolutely not. And he's now teaching at Rutgers. Now, all of this is hard to keep up with. Banned books, curricular revisions, gag orders. I think that's their point. They want it to be hard for us to keep up with, right? But I also want to point out something very quickly. I promise I'll be quiet now. The fight is also here. I don't want us to get the idea that it's just, right? Florida or Texas. Notice I did a little Spanish in there, right? I want to just understand, during the middle of the beginnings of the pandemic, local activists in where I live in South Brooklyn, in Bay Ridge, they asked me, hey, would you mind being on the local CUC, the Community Education Council? It's like a school board, but it was stripped of its power by a guy named Mike Bloomberg. Don't get me started. And so it mostly has advisory power. And one day I was at a typical school board meeting, and this was at the height of the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd protests. And I asked a simple question over that Zoom meeting, and I said, can you, to the superintendents there and the school leaders, your teachers and so forth, I said, can you just give us an update on the update on implicit bias training if our teachers and administrators have had it in our district? Because I'm just going to keep it real. A lot of the teachers and administrators don't look like the students in South Brooklyn, right? And I think you know where I'm going with that. And so they weren't able to answer the question. But some members of the board, other parent members, quickly attacked myself and a few others who were asking these simple questions. By the way, implicit bias training is not the end-all be-all of racism, but it's important, right? To check our biases, to check our prejudices, right? And they quickly responded in saying things. I'm paraphrasing here. I don't remember the exact words, but it was a series of meetings. It was like, I don't want someone coming in here and telling us what the unions are telling us to do. You're defending, and here I had also been defending a multicultural curricula. Right? You need to see yourselves in the curricula. And how dare you represent the AFT, which I wasn't, right? But how dare you and come in here and throw your critical race theory at us? How many of you heard of critical race theory?
I have.
I would love to meet the 4th grade teacher who's throwing, and they were accused, 4th grade teachers, of teaching critical race theory. Now, I've taught it in my courses, right? From Cheryl Harris to Kimberly Crenshaw, right to Derek Bell. I struggle teaching critical race theory. So if there's a 4th grade teacher out there teaching, I would love to meet this person, right? So I came back with that and I said, you know, and so that represented a little bit about what's going on here in New York City, right? So I want us, as we move along here, I want us to realize that the fight also appears itself in other ways. The last thing I'll say, it also appears itself in budget cuts. You don't need a ban, right, to actually ban, right? You don't need a directive, right, to disallow you the access to the courses you're taking right now, whether in Africana, and Pearls, Women, Gender Studies, Genetic Studies, you name it, right? So just keep that in mind. So I'll be quiet now. I have the esteemed honor of moderating this panel, and I also gave a little mini presentation. But to my left, I am going to introduce my colleague, a new colleague and friend, Sharon Wright Austin. You could read more about her background here in the sheets that you got when you came in. But I'll start off as a professor of political science at the University of Florida, and has also taught courses at the University of Louisville, where my mom went, Michigan, and Missouri, Columbia. Dr. Austin, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody, and thank you all for coming out. This is my first trip to Brooklyn. I've been to New York City before, so it's a really beautiful campus and beautiful city. So I think they told us to keep this at about 10 minutes. So I have a few comments, but I'm working on a book. I'm on sabbatical this year, and I'm working on a book entitled Politics in the Classroom, The Assault on Blackness and the Battle for Academic Freedom. And one of the things that I argue when I talk about what's happening not just in Florida but around the country is that it's an assault on many of the theories that are under attack. He mentioned critical race theory. Intersectionality is a theory that's commonly used by Black female scholars like myself to analyze the various experiences that women of color have with discrimination on the basis of their race, gender, class, sexual orientation, etc. And so I'm arguing in my book that especially since 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, when there were a lot of racial justice campaigns taking place on campuses around the nation, around the world really, that's when you really began to see sort of an uptick in the different laws that states were proposing. So Florida is known for the things that are happening there, and there are so many different pieces of legislation that I had to just pick and choose some of them because it seems like we're just being bombarded. It seems like almost every week I'm hearing about a new law that the legislature is proposing or that the governor has signed. So I want to just quickly begin by reading an excerpt from a report from May of last year, a preliminary report by the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, that you'll hear more about today. They had a special committee on academic freedom, and here's what they said about Florida. Florida is experiencing a politically and ideologically driven assault, unparalleled in U.S. history. If sustained, this onslaught threatens the very survival of meaningful higher education in the state, with dire implications for the entire country. The governor and the legislature are using their swift, aggressive, and ongoing hostile takeover of the new College of Florida, which took place in January of last year, as a test case for future encroachments on public colleges and universities across the country. Administrators from top to bottom are often deeply complicit in these political attacks or have explicitly supported them and risk becoming pawns in DeSantis's corrupt patronage system. And out of that report, I really like this part because it really gives a very good summary of exactly what's happening in Florida. And it's not just happening in Florida, it's happening all over the nation. And one of the things that I first found out, well, I knew about all of the different battles about academic freedom, but I became directly involved in 2021 as a political scientist. Oftentimes I'm called upon to talk about political issues, to talk about voting discrimination especially, and I was asked to serve as an expert witness. I was asked to write a report in a case that had been filed that challenged a recent law in Florida. We argued in the case, this was a case that was brought by the ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They asked me to write a report and argue that there was evidence of discrimination on the basis of race against especially African American and Latino voters. And so usually when you're asked to do this, usually your universities are really happy to know that someone on the faculty is considered to be an expert. It brings a lot of really positive attention, especially when you're fighting against any type of discrimination. But to my shock, two of my colleagues were also asked to serve as expert witnesses. And each of us were told, no, you can't participate, you can't write this report. And so, I'm from Memphis. My parents were born and raised in Mississippi Delta. My dad in 1938, my mom in 1940. So they were born and raised and lived through a society that I only have read about, Jim Crow. I even have had various experiences, of course, with racism and sexism as well. But so to me, that was a personal attack. My two colleagues who were also told that they couldn't participate were both white men who had written expert reports several times. This was my first time being able to be invited to write one. And I was told that this was adverse to the state's interest. So in other words, I guess the fight against racial discrimination is adverse to the state's interest is the way I interpret it. And so as a result of that, we ended up having to file a lawsuit. And in this lawsuit, eventually we won. Unfortunately, it's still in litigation, even though we forced them to change the policy that would make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. It's still in litigation simply because the university doesn't want to pay our attorney's fees, even though a court has told them to. They don't want to pay our attorney's fees, which are now like over $1 million, so I understand why. But that was my first, really as a faculty member, I never thought I would ever be in a position where I would ever have to sue a university where I've worked since 2001. But that was my first example of things that, in later years it got even worse. So I want to briefly talk about, in April of 2022, something that's called the Stop Woke Act has gotten a lot of attention all over the nation. I'm also one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit that's challenging this law that basically is saying to professors that you can't teach a course in any way so that I guess you instill any type of guilt in anyone because of their race or because of their gender. So the language says that it prohibits lessons or trainings that teach that individuals are inherently racist or sexist because of their race or sex, that people are privileged or oppressed due to their race or sex, and other related concepts. So that's really vague language, but basically it's saying to professors like myself who teach courses on race and gender that you can't teach a course in any way, I guess to sort of instill any type of white guilt or make anyone feel guilty because of the race or guilty because of things like the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow. And so that's something that we have challenged in court. And then recently, in December of 2023, just a few months ago, SB 266 was a law that was passed in May of last year, and it resulted in the firing of our chief diversity officer and also of 13 other people who do work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. In a lot of places also at the University of North Florida, which is in Jacksonville, they closed their LGBTQ center. So that's the type of thing that we're dealing with in Florida. And there's some others as well, but I know I don't have a lot of time. But one of the things that I want to talk about.
You're good.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's another one I want to talk about.
Great.
Which was also passed in last year, SB 846. I have to look at my notes because I get these numbers confused. So last year, SB 846, there recently was just a really huge protest on campus because it, quote, bars state colleges and universities from accepting grants from or participating in partnerships or agreements with a college or university based in a foreign country of concern, or with a foreign principal, except for those approved by the Board of Governors. And so, and also it restricts international students from China, Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, Russia, and North Korea from being employed as graduate assistants to conduct academic research. So that is also something that is under the subject of a lawsuit. Two students of Chinese descent and also a professor filed a lawsuit in federal court. So there are a lot of different lawsuits challenging these. These are just some of the laws. I wish I had time to talk about more, but these are just some of the laws that are taking place in my state. But this problem is also taking place in other states as well. So I want to talk briefly about just even some of the attacks on our union. We have a very strong union called the UFF, or the United Faculty of Florida. They have been very supportive of me and of other faculty members and students and staff as well. And even there have been attacks on the part of our state to sort of, I guess, shut them down or even to try to do things to make it more difficult for them to fight against the different things that are happening in our state. On July of last year, July 1st, a law was passed that said that the UFF couldn't deduct fees from faculty's paychecks. So before that time, if you wanted to be a member of the union, you could just have them deduct out of your paycheck. I guess, when you got paid, they just deducted the amount out. And so as a result of this law, they could no longer do that. So that meant that all of the people who were getting money deducted from their paychecks now had to actually go and make an electronic payment. The purpose of this was to basically hope that people would not do that, and so hope that they wouldn't get the money that they needed to support lawsuits such against the laws that I've mentioned. And then there was another one, SB 256 was also passed last year. In 2023, I guess, was a real active year in Florida for this type of legislation. SB 256 said that the membership of the United Faculty of Florida had to be at least 60%. So they had to dramatically increase their membership, and if not, they would have been decertified, quote unquote. In other words, they would no longer exist. So as a result of this, the UFF was able to increase their membership. So whenever they're attacked or whenever there is any type of attack that takes place in Florida, people always come up with, I guess, an adequate response to sort of fight back. And that's the one point that I want to leave you with, is that you have to find a way to fight back. It's not easy being in a position, if you ever have to file a lawsuit, you know, no one wants to be in a position where they have to sue their employer and then go back to work. It's very uncomfortable being on campus at times, but it's something that you have to find a way. And even if you're a student, you have to find your voice somewhere and find a way to fight back and not feel powerless. And also support people who are in organizations that are being attacked. So the response that the UFF has made, besides dramatically increasing its membership and also receiving the pay that it needs to continue to support lawsuits and other efforts, they have gone on media campaigns. That was something that was very supportive, helpful to me when I was trying to be an expert witness. They've expanded their affiliations outside of Florida, around the nation. And so I guess I want to conclude by saying that this is nothing new. If you know anything about American history, whenever there's been any type of progress, there's always been a backlash, and that's the theme of my book. And then also I want to refer you to a really good book, Emancipation Betrayed, by Professor Paul Ortiz. And one of the things that he talks about in his book that talks about African-American organizing in Florida from the end of slavery to 1920 is that Black Floridians and other people, but Black Floridians in particular, have always made a lot of progress in civil rights during every period of American history. There never has been a time in which African Americans have not been involved in organizing and also in working in labor unions and other types of unions. And so this that we're experiencing now, as frustrating as it is for your generation to have to deal with this, really this is nothing new. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Austin. Awesome, thank you. And then I'm gonna go in order here. Forgive me, my paper is all over the place. I'd like to introduce Risa L. Lieberwitz, who is a professor of labor and employment law in the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations, where she's been a professor since 1982. You could read the rest of her background here. Colleague, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thank you for inviting me. This is an extraordinary series of events, and you all are so fortunate to be part of this. So let me just start by, in terms of telling you something about the AAUP that you've already heard about, the American Association of University Professors. The AAUP was founded in 1915. And so it's been around for a while. And as Dr. Austin said, you know, none of this is new. And so when the AAUP was founded in 1915, it was to fight for academic freedom and for job security for faculty and for due process for faculty and for collective governance by faculty, because at that time, when nobody had labor rights in the US, faculty were being fired because of speaking out on different kinds of public issues. And so we're still fighting the same fight. It's different from 1915, but it has some real resonance in terms of the issues that are in place. In addition to being a professor of labor and employment law, as you've heard, I'm also very active in the AAUP. At the national level, as a national organization, the AAUP has its national office in Washington, D.C., and I'm the general counsel for the AAUP, which is a part-time position usually held by a full-time faculty member. And it's my honor to be part of the work of the AAUP, which I'll talk about a bit today. And so the AAUP has been involved in these issues, not only since 1915, but more recently, from the start of and before the current onslaught of the current wave of political, ideological, and financial attacks on higher education. The AAUP has been active in fighting back against this repression and in fighting for and in support of faculty and for the academic profession and for higher education in the common good and for the common good. And of course, this also is in support of students, not only the faculty right to teach and to speak publicly and to do research, but students' rights to learn and to be engaged also on campus in various ways. And so both faculty and students, as well as staff, all have an interest in more democratic governance on campus, and we continue to fight for that. And so I wanted to point out to you a number of ways in which the AAUP has been involved. You've already heard some of them. With regard to very recently in January 2024, AAUP put out a statement that was quite a long one about political interference by external forces, whether it's Congress or state legislators or donors. This kind of political interference undermines our basic principles of academic freedom of expression, of collective self-governance on campus, of the independence of universities, whether public or private, to be able to do the work that we do with the freedom that is required for it. This applies whether it's a public university or a private university. So we put out a statement about that. There was the joint statement with the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, that you also heard about, dealing with these same kinds of issues. And so at the national level, the AAUP has been a public voice for the academic profession. Our president, President Irene Mulvey, has been issuing hard-hitting statements. There are 4 between October 24th and February 8th concerning repression by university administrators and by Congress, donors, politicians at the state level. We've been putting out these statements consistently. We file amicus curiae briefs, friend of the court briefs, in cases like the one that Dr. Austin talked about with regard to challenging this so-called Stop Woke Act in Florida. And we put out important reports, which are also very powerful. AAUP does investigations of individual schools and more recently of system-wide problems of undermining academic freedom in all of these areas. And we put out reports which are so important for not only naming what's happening, investigating, naming, reporting on it, but also sanctioning and censuring institutions, as I said, including system-wide institutions, as in Florida and North Carolina and Georgia, which are undermining our basic principles. And we put these out for people to use them. And so the kind of media presence, the public presence is so important. And the basic principles, again, are academic freedom, shared governance, which may be through things like faculty senates, and job security of tenure, and collective bargaining as part of that governance, which is so important. And the attacks on these basic principles are all related. And so I also want to mention before I go on to say that there is a National Day of Action for Higher Education and the Common Good, which is being planned for April 17th. And it's being led by multiple AAUP chapters which exist across the country at that kind of local level, including University of Pennsylvania's chapter, NYU, Purdue, and others. And so this is one of those kinds of results of the pushback, which is so important. So what I want to do is just take a few minutes to talk to you about this point that Dr. Austin made, which is this is not new, and to create some context about the fight back that's taking place by AAUP and other allies in this area. And that is that the current wave of attacks on higher education are part of an ongoing corporatization of the university. And so it's part of that ongoing process that I'll talk about for a moment, but it's also, as we all know, not only an extension of this, but an intensification of those trends. It's really an existential crisis that we're facing now. And so just a few words on the corporatization that started in particular with the Reagan administration in the 1980s, where with privatization and cuts in public funding, the universities took the hit as well, where universities adopted very much a kind of private market model that shifts towards serving private interests, particularly private interests of business, as opposed to the public good more generally. And that is evident in things we all know about, the commodification of education. It's kind of an individual return on investment, the decrease in public funding, the increase in student debt, treating students as customers, commercializing research, and adopting a corporate labor model which has shifted from primarily tenure track and tenure faculty to primarily non-tenure track contingent faculty without the job security that's essential to exercise academic freedom. There's also been an undermining of democratic governance on campuses and an attack on labor unions, as you've heard about. These are all related kinds of attacks. And the AAUP has consistently been taking actions, the kinds I've been describing before, to identify these attacks, to sanction them, and to give people ammunition to use against these attacks. And as I mentioned, many of these actions by the AAUP have shifted now to look at statewide systems. And so we have reports on UNC as a system. There was a report on the institutional racism in North Carolina as a system of higher education. There's a Georgia statewide report from the AAUP, another one attacking and censuring and sanctioning the system of higher ed in Georgia for undermining this job security of tenure broadly. And so in the current moment, these are just examples, in the current moment what we're seeing is an increasingly hostile and aggressive external threat to universities with attacks by state legislatures, by Congress, and by wealthy and powerful donors who want to control what is taught, what is learned, what is publicly debated in universities. And these targets have been shifting and expanding to include teaching about racial history in the US, about racism, about gender identity, or teaching and public discussions about the Israeli occupation of Palestine, or for protests against universities' complicity in such actions. Now, having adopted a corporatized model of higher education, university administrations are in a weakened position to push back. And so now what they're doing is being very compliant with these external kinds of threats. And what we've seen are university administrations which are adopting restrictive or repressive measures against speech, along with all the other kinds of external threats that are being discussed today. And so the AAUP has been involved in this. We have the special report that Dr. Austin referred to about Florida. We have the amicus briefs that I've mentioned, and as I also mentioned earlier, after October 7th, when university administrations started adopting these kinds of repressive and restrictive measures on speech, the AAUP has put out multiple statements. You can find them all on our website, and I don't have the time to go through them today, but I just want to take a moment, if I can, to quote from one of these statements. It's the most recent one on February 8th. It's called, "The time is now," this is an AAUP statement, "the time is now to resist political interference." And I'm just going to quote 2 sentences. "Although today's inquisition targets groups and individuals that criticize the state of Israel or U.S. policy toward Israel, it is actually an expansion of a broad effort to undermine the integrity and democratic mission of U.S. higher education. As such, its repressive effects are not limited merely to those who espouse controversial views about the Middle East, but to all members of the academic community." And so we are all in this together. We should all fight for the right to freely express our views, whether in the classroom or outside the classroom, in our research or in our public statements, in our testimonies, as Dr. Austin talked about. And so, as Joe Hill said, don't waste time mourning. What comes next? Organize. All right, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor. We got a lot to talk about. Wow. Awesome. And now I have the esteemed honor as well to bittersweet moment, right? Because we will miss you. Dr. Bank Muñoz, Carolina Bank Muñoz, is a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, and her work focuses on immigration, labor, work in Latin America, mostly the co-author of People's Guide to New York City, which I had the honor of contributing to. Doctora, the floor is yours.
Y'all are making me more nervous. Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks to the Wolf and to the panelists, and of course to our Hess scholar, Dr. Paul Ortiz. Before I forget, I just want to, if the students in the room don't know, the faculty and staff on campus have been without a contract for over a year. You can read more about it here. And for the faculty and staff who are in the room, we're having a social, our second annual beer and buttons event on April 8th from 4:30 to 6. So please join us in the faculty lounge. Okay, so for the students who don't know this history, our CUNY system has many unions. Our union is the Professional Staff Congress and represents 30,000 faculty and staff across the CUNY system and was organized in 1972. So unions are organizations organized by workers who want to have power and control over their wages and working conditions. And that power comes from what we call a collective bargaining agreement, which you've heard, referenced, or a contract, which is negotiated between the union and management. The right to organize unions is protected by our national labor laws and some state laws. Some state laws are fighting aggressively against unions, but in the case of New York State, we still have a state that supports unions. So when you are in your employment situation, right? I know some of you work at Starbucks, work at Amazon, right? And in all of the multiple places where you work, you have the right to form a union if you don't already have one, and it's something to think about. So I'm going to start with just going off of some of the stuff that Risa said. I'm going to start with kind of perhaps my main point, and then I'll get to what our union does. But so the moral panic being created by the media today, both the so-called liberal media and the right-wing media about the culture wars on college campuses is dangerous. It conveniently focuses all of the attention on wokeness, bias, and indoctrination while not addressing the dismantling of public higher education through state disinvestment. And I would say that perhaps this disinvestment is the greatest threat to academic freedom of all. So in preparation for this panel, I conducted a quick content analysis. Y'all are gonna have to forgive me. I am a sociologist after all, and I love data. So this weekend, as I was preparing my remarks, I thought, I have a feeling that the New York Times spends a lot of time talking about Columbia University. How many times has Columbia University and the culture wars been referenced in the New York Times in the last 7 months? So, 855 references to Columbia University in the last 7 months.
Sensationalism.
A lot of those were paid death notices, so I took those out of the pool, right? So when you take a lot of the irrelevant articles out of the pool, we're left with about 400 references to Columbia University. 58 of those references are specifically about the culture wars, right? That is what is highlighted. Looking at the same period of time, how many times did the New York Times reference CUNY? 95 times, right? And some of those were paid death notices too. So when you take those out of the pool, we're talking about close to 50. So 400 versus 50, right? 36,000 students at Columbia University, 250,000 students at CUNY. That is what the New York Times thinks about our university system, right? On the CUNY side, there were only 3 references to the culture wars, and 3 of the articles were about this Repair Act that is about taxing Columbia and NYU to pay their fair share of property taxes to fund CUNY, right? 0 articles focused on the conditions at CUNY, including our dilapidated infrastructure, an understaffing crisis, the loss of enrollment. 0 in the last 7 months, right? So as Tressie McMillan Cottom brilliantly articulated in the New York Times column last week, the national, quote, the national debate about the so-called woke campuses does not reflect what most college students care about. She cites a report put out by the Lumina Foundation and Gallup, which suggests that students are far more concerned about gun violence on their campuses and having access to reproductive health care on their campuses than they are about quote-unquote device topics being taught. In fact, the opposite is true. Students want to be exposed to these topics and generally do not want restrictions to be placed on how they're taught in the classroom, right? So keeping in mind this context, I'll roll back to what our union does. So academic freedom is central to academic unions, of course, and ours is no exception. I want to read from the preamble to our collective bargaining agreement, which says, quote, whereas CUNY and the PSC seek to maintain and encourage, in accordance with law, full freedom of inquiry, teaching, research, and publication of results, the parties subscribe to academic freedom for faculty members. The principles of academic freedom are recognized as applicable to other members of the instructional staff to the extent that their duties include teaching, research, and publication of results, the selection of library and other educational materials, or the formation of academic policy. So that is how our collective bargaining, right, inside of our collective bargaining agreement, we have our academic freedom is protected. Now, one of the major limitations of this academic freedom is that it is not currently extended to non-instructional staff, like our higher education officers. Those are the folks who work in financial aid, who work as advisors, right? They are in our union, but these rights are not extended to them. So to remedy this, that is a subject of bargaining right now in our contract negotiations, right? So in addition to our contract, CUNY's manual on general policy uses a 1940, maybe they should update this, the 1940 AAUP statement on academic freedom to govern the institution. So one of the main ways that our union protects academic freedom is through a process known as due process, right? And most people understand that unions negotiate over wages, right, and working conditions, and they think that that is the most important thing unions do, but actually I would argue that the most important thing unions do is protect due process, right, which is the process that prevents employees from being unilaterally fired by management, right? In non-union workplaces, you can show up 10 minutes late to work one day and your boss can say, done, you're done. We can just fire you. In unionized workplaces, they can't do that. They have to go through a process, a disciplinary process that proves that you did some wrongdoing. And if they can't prove it, they can't fire you, okay? So due process is really, really important. And it's not a perfect process. I don't want you to leave this room thinking that, wow, if I get a union, all of my problems are solved, right? Because it's an imperfect process. For example, in our own union, the process works really well for full-time faculty and college lab technicians. It works less well for higher education officers whose pay is often suspended while they're undergoing disciplinary processes, which is not the case for full-time faculty and college lab technicians, right? So another subject to bargaining currently is to change that, right? Because that's unfair. But they can't be fired during that process, which is important. Perhaps it works the least well for our contingent faculty members or part-time faculty members who can be hired and fired semester to semester, except for those who are on 1- and 3-year contracts, which goes to Risa's point about how contingency, right, how this corporate model and this drive to create more contingency affects and shapes, academic freedom. So, but in any case, even those part-time faculty members who are being disciplined, they have to go through the process, right? And it can, it can take a little while, but they can't be unilaterally disciplined. So due process is a really important part of union representation, and inevitably what that means is that sometimes to ensure the due process rights of all members of our union, we have to support the due process rights of members who we disagree with, right? Fundamentally. And when I was grievance officer before becoming chapter chair of the union, I had to constantly remind myself, I am not defending people's actions, I am defending people's rights to a process, right? And that is subtle, giving them a fair shake is different from kind of endorsing what they're doing, right? But it's messy, very messy. So while due process is a reason members can't unilaterally be disciplined for what they say in the classroom, again, it's not perfect. These disciplinary processes can be long, they can be stressful, they can be time consuming, they can damage people's reputations, right? That can have a lasting consequence even when they are, absolved of any wrongdoing. Just yesterday, I learned of 2 part-time faculty members at John Jay and Hunter, for example, who have been non-reappointed for their pro-Palestine positions, right? So that just gives you another example of how, how this plays out in terms of the part-time faculty. Much harder to do with full-time faculty. So given the imperfect mechanisms to protect academic freedom in our labor contract, it's especially important to have strong governance bodies, which have also been referenced, right? Every university has governance bodies. Our university has a central governance body called the University Faculty Senate, and then there are campus-based governance bodies. So we have to work in tandem. Our union and our governance bodies have to work in tandem, separately and together, around these, protections of our critical rights. Okay, so let me fast forward. Yeah, I should wrap it up. Yeah. Okay, so fast forward, there have been some recent examples of things that have happened, right? Like the canceling of the film Israelism at Hunter College, which, because our union pushed back on that, they were able to show their film screening. There's been doxing across CUNY. There's been, but again, this isn't new, right? In 2013, BC invited Judith Butler and Omar Bagoudi to come to campus, and City Council threatened to withhold funds from Brooklyn College if that was going to go forward. And guess what? CUNY didn't save the day protecting academic freedom. Shockingly, weirdly, Michael Bloomberg was like, no, you can't do that to, the City University of New York. Blew everybody's mind, right? There's also current bylaws changes that are being tried, that CUNY is trying to ram down our throats. And so our union has responded in lots of ways, right? We have an academic freedom committee in our union that tracks what's happening on campuses. Our president has put out various statements that you can read online. We've pressured the chancellor to put doxing resources on the CUNY website, which is not enough, but it's, more than what existed before we pushed the chancellor. And we were able to successfully, with UFS, delay these bylaws changes. But going back to my first point, and I'll end with this, one of the most important things our union does to protect academic freedom is fight for the kind of investment in public higher education that's critical to the advancement of a democratic society. And I'm particularly proud of our union's involvement and development of the New Deal for CUNY platform, which would transform CUNY with a massive investment from the state, including free tuition, more mental health counselors and advisors, and a serious investment in hiring full-time faculty.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Good speech.
Thank you, Doctora. And I do want to also add that the PSC chapter under your leadership and then previous leaderships were really instrumental in fighting for the Pearls department. So I just want to thank felicidades. Thank you. And congratulations. It's been a long day. And speaking of long days, long weeks, a person who knows and needs no introduction by now. It's Wednesday, right? Is it Wednesday? Yeah. All right. I'll just be quiet. Dr. Ortiz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan. And it's such an honor to be here. I just don't get tired of saying this, but I love Brooklyn College. Y'all are great. The faculty, the staff, the students, under siege, as we've heard, as we've read. You have held the line in favor of intellectual freedom, of democracy, public education for the higher good. What I'd like to do, and I would be remiss if I just didn't say just how cool it is to be on this panel with like 4 fellow union members. I mean, it doesn't always happen across the country, so I feel really blessed and my heart is full. So thank you for having me again. What I want to talk about is something that Professor Austin mentioned, and actually everyone has mentioned it at one point or the other, and that is our relationship to our surrounding neighborhoods and our sustaining communities, which bolster us, which build our campuses, which sustain our campuses. And I think that this is one of the main challenges we face right now. This morning I talked about oral history in an age of fascism, in 2 ages of fascism, right? One in the 1930s, and I talked about Zora Neale Hurston and Stetson Kennedy, and how they developed oral history and kind of a small d democratic folklore practice during times of rising fascism and Nazism. And then we also talked a little bit about what it means to do oral history now in a time when authoritarianism is on the rise everywhere, and how important what we do as students and lifelong learners really is. I think one of the reasons that we've been under assault in Florida goes back, well, there's a number of reasons, but one that I'll point to, a few years ago, Susan Hageman and I wrote a piece in Thought in Action, NEA Higher Education Journal, on how Gainesville, Florida, retired Richard Spencer. And I don't know how many of you remember Richard Spencer. At one point, he was the rising, young, suit and tie fascist who CNN just loved. Every time I flew through Atlanta Hartsfield Airport, he was on being interviewed. They loved him. He would talk about things like peaceful ethnic cleansing. Okay? It was up to our union to tell our administration there is no such thing as peaceful ethnic cleansing. Everywhere he went and spoke, Charlottesville, other places, with him came hundreds, sometimes thousands of angry, armed men, primarily men, some women too, would march through neighborhoods. Remember what happened in Charlottesville, the violence, the horrors that happened there. But when Spencer planned to come to Gainesville and the University of Florida back in 2017, we had a big surprise for him. And we formed coalitions. And the United Faculty of Florida was really the backbone behind that. And we worked with Muslim student organizations, Jewish student organizations, progressive organizations in the community, and made it so hot for him and his followers that instead of having, at one point, we were supposed to have 5,000 armed thugs descending on Gainesville, but we organized such a broad coalition that I think they only had like 56 or 70 of them that came with Spencer. Now, they still did some harm. They shot at someone, actually. But we essentially, and a week after his failure at UF, he came out publicly and said, I'm finished with the college lecture circuit. It's not fun anymore. And I think that's part of the reason that we're under siege, because we held the line against fascism in 2017. It wasn't just the union, but the union was a big backbone of that. I'm just going to read an excerpt out of this piece to talk about that coalition building effort, because I see it happening here as well. So faculty affiliated with the union promoted digital and paper petitions, letter writing campaigns. We begged our administration not to let this guy get on campus. Some union members using their expertise as scholars to address issues such as the history of racism, white supremacy, and the Holocaust contributed op-eds to local newspapers and participated in public fora and teach-ins. We began working with a broad array of area activists and organizations, including members of the Alachua County NAACP, Veterans for Peace, National Women's Liberation, the Gainesville Anti-Fascist Committee, and the Alachua Labor Coalition, among others. Meanwhile, we supported activist students who created and led No Nazis at UF, which was actually a formal organization, No Nazis at UF. A grassroots organization composed of working class and first-gen college students who worked tirelessly to educate, mobilize, and organize a broad base of on and off-campus individuals and groups. They used an expansive message of radical inclusivity and anti-racism, welcoming all who opposed Spencer's ideology of white supremacy and ethnic cleansing. No Nazis at UF's Big Tent organizing strategy enabled a diverse coalition that ranged from members of the industrial workers of the world to local Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities. Their efforts included an anti-Spencer petition drive, as well as news conferences, community rallies, and a march to UF's main administration building in an effort to engage administrators. Ironically, a campus leadership that is supposed to uphold the ideals of dialogue and freedom of speech refused to engage with student organizers. Tigard Hall, the central administration building, was in lockdown mode for the entire week. Many people would call me and say, well, Paul, we're surprised that you were opposed to Richard Spencer coming to talk on our campus. We thought you, of all people, would uphold academic freedom. I said, well, you know what? Our RAs in the dorms have been told that if there's any violence or any individuals hurt in their buildings, they will be responsible during the Spencer visit. And I would say to my dear colleagues, well, what are you going to do during the Spencer visit? And they said, oh, well, Paul, I'm going to be in New York, or I'm going to be in San Francisco. And I'm like, I'm so glad for you, you're able to leave. But if you're an RA, you can't leave during the semester unless you have some kind of a written excuse. So it was an amazing campaign, and it was successful, but we knew that there would be blowback. One of the things that Professor Austin said is that anytime you have a struggle, you make some forward motion, there's going to be pushback. And we believed at the time in the union that there were people in Florida who supported Richard Spencer, not just for abstract academic, reasons of First Amendment rights, but people who supported his white supremacist message. We are in the United States of America. We have a history of white supremacy. And so part of what we're facing now is the blowback. But the good news is that we continue to have tremendous public support. And I think part of the reason why, and I've been a labor historian for a long time, I've never seen so much support for a labor organizing campaign. But in conclusion, I think one of the reasons we have the support is the coalition building. And as long as we can hold on to that reciprocity, and when we talk about academic freedom at UF, Professor Austin and I, we start with the students. You, the students, have the right to major in whatever you will, whether it's gender studies, criminology, engineering, education, et cetera, et cetera. The state doesn't have the right to decide for you, although they would very much like to. So thank you.
All right. Colleagues, I'm going to ask you to step to the side because that light is about to go on, and believe me, it can be because I want to show something very quickly. All right, so it's time for Q&A, and I have the right here to ask my colleagues here one quick question. And what I want to do is just show a quick graph, a visual to sort of get us talking, then we'll shift over to student questions. This is PEN America. They're an advocacy group that documents that fights for academic freedom and so forth. I do want to point out, per Risa, your point, that this ends actually in 2023 and doesn't account for statements that are in solidarity with Palestine. It's not measured here, so I just want to say that outside right now. But these are proposed educational censorship bills and policies affecting higher education. Check out this graph, right? And there's a lot of cool graphs on this website, by the way. But here's one. You look, this is 2021 to 2022. It goes up. And it comes down a little bit, then you see an incline here of other kinds of restrictions. Now, here's my question to my colleagues here. And what role do we think? This is an interesting spike, right? And then boom. Where are unions here? What are we doing? What do we expect in 2024? Like, what is your take of what kind of external variables or factors are sorry, the sociology is coming out of me. What's happening here that helps explain with a centering of unions? Colegas, what are your thoughts?
Are we going to have this stand?
Yeah. Sorry.
My head's in the way.
No, but it's really like, that's what I was, yeah.
Yep.
Tell you what, I'll undo it for a second.
Can I just start with, I'm the one who probably has to go a little early.
Do it, please.
Yeah, it's an interesting graph. Yeah, you know, I've been thinking about this as a general matter, that is that the aim is the same, no matter whether it's the gag order legislation, as it's been called, the so-called divisive concept legislation, or whether it's other kinds of political interference. Now the attack is more like a DEI as opposed to teaching racial history in a particular way, though all of that continues. And now it's, as you said, you know, now it's also the repression that's coming out of Congress's deep concern for anti-Semitism, which I don't believe for a second, and not just me, they don't care about anti-Semitism, but using it as, you know, as a cover for more political, intellectual repression. Is this good? Is that good? So, so I think that the way in which we're seeing a dip is also testament to the pushback, right? The the litigation, the coalition building. Unions are part of a social movement, right? And so we have unions, we have other civil rights organizations. These are allies that are working together. Like I can tell you the AAUP is working with other civil rights organizations and thinking about ways that we can push back. So I think that's central to the idea of unions as part of a social movement, but to recognize that this is not going to stop, and that with the universities under attack now for their lives, and as I said, the weakening of the institution as an independent institution because of corporatization, that what we're going to see are these continued attacks just in other forms. But the aim is the same. The aim is to muzzle us. The aim is to stop us from thinking independently and from speaking. And so the struggle is going to be a lifetime struggle. And I hope everybody here is excited to join. Because sometimes we forget to talk about the joy of organizing and working together. It's where I am at home. It's part of a community. And so sometimes we think of it as like, oh, this is such a struggle, and it's hard. But it's the joy of being together. And I think that that dip shows that.
Thank you.
I'll just say that I think that we have this conception of unions being service organizations often, right? That you pay your dues and you get benefits for those dues, right? But as Risa just said, there's a different model, and our own union's model is that unions are a social movement organization, and that means that we are only as strong as the members who participate in our union, right? And so I think that's true of all organizations, of all activist organizations. Organizations and institutions are only as strong as the people who are active in them. And so, yeah, so please get involved, find ways to participate in whatever, you know, everybody is stretched thin, everybody is working hard and multiple jobs, and it's really hard to find the time. So pick one thing that you think you can do, right? And then do it, because it does make a difference. And, you know, what's the saying? Many hands make the work later, or something like along those lines, right? So I'll leave you with that.
Paul, I see you writing down there, but I do see also eager students. So do you mind if we just go to the students? And yeah, awesome. So your hand first, please, by all means.
I got a question for all of you. Oh, thank you. Since you've all talked about the unions and all this stuff,
and coming from a predominantly right-wing community myself, I just want to ask, do you ever plan on teaching a union-related course if you had the chance? What would it be?
I wish that I could teach a course on academic freedom, because I want to echo some of the things that were just mentioned, but I teach a class at the University of Florida. We have a program called Quest, and I teach a Quest 1 class called The Politics of Race at UF. And in that class, I talk about just the integration of the university. I mostly focus on race, and I mostly focus on the experiences of Black students, faculty, and staff. But I wish I could expand it and teach a class on academic freedom, but I don't even think it would be allowed nowadays, because even with the class that I'm currently teaching, that really, the irony about that class is that I was asked to develop that class. The Quest program is something that's required, but they don't have enough classes. So in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, I got a call from the provost's office, and I was asked to develop a class. And so I put this one together, but this was before all of these things have happened with all these different laws and things. And I've been trying to get the class approved, but I know they're giving me the runaround, because I just, last week, you need to change this and change that and change this. And they don't want to say to me, take out the part about critical race theory, but that's what, and I'm hoping that they'll come out and say it, because I'm working with the attorneys in the lawsuit, and I'm like, well, as soon as they say that, that's going to really help our lawsuit, and they know that, but they're trying to say, oh, well, this needs to be changed, or change the wording and blah, 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 blah. So I would like to teach a class on academic freedom similar to the one that I'm currently teaching, but I know if they would just give me the runaround, it would be very difficult to do.
Oh, man, that'd be awesome. Colleagues, yeah, anyone?
That is what I teach. I teach in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. That is what I teach. And academic freedom.
Well, and I teach labor history for University of Florida, and within 5 minutes of registration, it's filled. And because your generation, students, lifelong learners, labor history is back. It really is back. But I also want to stress there's labor studies. There's a whole other range of things, like Risa talks about the law, right? There's labor employment. There's human relations. There's all these different aspects of labor studies. But all of those fields are enjoying a boom time, right? And so it's really exciting to be a labor historian.
In sociology, we teach a class called Workers United. I'm sure that, does history have a labor
course right now?
philosophy?
So the labor history course. I can't think of one. Okay, I'm just trying to repeat what you were saying.
Daniel, no?
No, not. We have a course called Race, Justice, and Equality, but that's,
And that's again, that's philosophy. I like shouting out these courses. Anyone else want to shout out more courses? I see Professor Aha right there.
In our intro to Pearls, and also you
Can
don't
you
get
use the
it.
mic so we can hear you?
Yeah, in our intro to Puerto Rican and Latinx studies, sometimes depending on also who's teaching it, because some folks like myself have more expertise, so you'll get more about labor. And then others, you'll see it in a couple of weeks. But we also have a course called Social and Environmental Movements in Latin America, right? And you are giving us ideas about also updating our curricula again. So thank you, that was a great question.
In English. Yes, thank you. Oh,
yeah, actually, in the English department, I'm teaching a seminar on labor literature right now. So, there's the role of culture and the arts and labor, I think, is really understudied. You don't often see courses in literature and visual art in, for instance, labor studies schools. But it turns out at Brooklyn College, if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can come find me. I'm Joseph Enten. I teach in the English department.
Anyone else want to shout out course? No, you need a mic so we hear you on the live stream as well. This is important.
Well, I was going to say your banned books course.
All right.
Extremely.
Next spring.
2026.
Five.
Sorry, I don't know what you're
Can I take it too?
Yeah.
Psychology of Climate Crisis, and there's a whole unit on labor and the role of unions and work in the climate change.
We're building a lot of courses here. We actually have to wrap up.
I see a student, we have 10 minutes, right? 2:15? No? This is such a great, come on.
I just want to give a quick shout
All right.
out to the panelists. I've taken Carolina's class and Professor Allen's class, and just like thanking all the professors, also here Dr. Jasmine Mitchell, for creating such a safe space for a lot of students to really like talk about issues that are happening on campus. And while many of us may work either full-time students and full-time employees, I think it's really important to kind of make those spaces and vocalizing what our concerns are, and you know, also giving our hands and flowers to professors that really deserve it. And yeah, that's that.
Okay. All right. Solidarity. It's 2:07. I wish we had time for more, but we welcome thoughts and ideas. Have a great day. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. I know Risa has a. Yes,